Hi everyone, my name is Michelle Rourke and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at Griffith University Law School. So I would usually be speaking to you from the land of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples, but today I'm recording this from Canberra, which is Ngunnawal country, and I'd like to thank the custodians of this land and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Thank you to Professor Rimmer for inviting me to talk about the pandemic treaty today and one very specific aspect of it, pathogen access and benefit sharing. Associate Professor Deborah Gleeson from La Trobe University talked about the failure of various voluntary efforts that were established during the COVID-19 pandemic to enhance fair and equitable sharing of pandemic-related products, and how that failure precipitated the pandemic accord negotiations. Then Professor Gleeson very helpfully outlined the proposed measures in the pandemic treaty or pandemic accord that are most relevant to accessing pandemic-related products. These include articles on research and development, access to technology and know-how, supply chain and logistics, and access and benefit sharing. Now, she said she wouldn't go too deep into access and benefit sharing because that's what I was going to talk about, and that's precisely what I intend to do now. To do that, I want to take you back to the beginning to see what access and benefit sharing is, where it came from, and what it was supposed to achieve. In 1992, the Convention on Biological Diversity was adopted at the Rio Earth Summit. It's one of the most widely adopted treaties going, with 196 states parties, not including the United States. The treaty had three key objectives: the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of benefits arising out of the utilisation of genetic resources. And it's this third objective that has been shortened to access and benefit sharing. That is, access to genetic resources and the sharing of benefits associated with their use. The benefits generated would go back to the country that provided the genetic resources and then go towards the first two objectives, so delivering conservation and sustainable use projects. What this actually looked like is a contract between the country of origin of a genetic resource and the user of a genetic resource, who might be a biotech company, agricultural business, cosmetics or pharmaceutical company, who wanted to use the genetic resource in their research and development. When the ABS mechanism was designed, it was about regulating things like blockbuster drugs derived from nature. This is just one example, the Madagascan periwinkle plant that was used to make anti-cancer drugs. The CBD said that countries providing the genetic resource for the R&D process that produce these sorts of innovations should get a share of the benefits. And benefits could be monetary, like royalties from the sale of this anti-cancer drug, or non-monetary, like favourable terms on intellectual property licenses, capacity building, or collaboration on the research and development with scientists from the provider country. The thing is, not all genetic resources are the type of genetic resources you want to conserve, at least not in their natural environment. So according to the definition of genetic resources within the CBD, all pathogens meet the definition of genetic resources, with the possible exception of prions. That means that these genetic resources are subject to access and benefit sharing rules. Towards the end of 2006, the Indonesian government said they were no longer going to share their pathogens with the World Health Organization's global influenza surveillance network because they said those viruses were Indonesia's sovereign genetic resources under the CBD, and they did not consent to the terms on which those viruses were being shared with various pharmaceutical companies. This led to an uproar in many of the rich countries, with legal scholars and commentators saying that this action was not in line with the intent of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and that viruses are not something we want to conserve, rather they're something we want to eradicate. The thing is, we definitely do conserve viruses and other pathogens. We just do it in freezers and liquid nitrogen rather than in conservation parks or marine protected areas. Okay, so in 2011, the World Health Assembly adopted the Pandemic Influenza Preparedness Framework, or the PIP framework, which acknowledges that yes, countries do have sovereign rights over their pathogen samples, and that pathogen samples are subject to access and benefit sharing rules. But it decides that influenza viruses with pandemic potential should be shared under the multilateral PIP framework rather than the bilateral sharing that occurs by default under the Convention on Biological Diversity. So this time, there are many provider countries and there are many user parties, including diagnostics manufacturers, vaccine and antiviral manufacturers, and also universities and other research institutions. But instead of agreeing on ABS terms with the country of origin, on a case-by-case basis, the WHO acts as an intermediary with some standard terms and conditions around the sharing of benefits. The user parties share benefits with the WHO to be distributed to countries based on public health risk and need in the event of an influenza pandemic. So we have a trade here. Countries provide their sovereign influenza viruses to the WHO for the opportunity to potentially receive benefits during the next influenza pandemic. The PIP framework has been deemed a success by the World Health Organization. They say that more countries have shared influenza viruses and that the WHO has secured more than 400 million doses of pandemic influenza vaccine. But there are many problems with the PIP framework. For starters, I want to clarify that the PIP framework hasn't secured actual doses of vaccine, it has secured promises for vaccines. These 400 million doses that vaccine manufacturers have promised to the WHO in the event of an influenza pandemic are currently just numbers on a spreadsheet based on fairly flimsy commitments in some standard material transfer agreements, or SMTAs. I'm not just calling these flimsy because I don't like them. There are a bunch of reasons that I outline in this analysis of the publicly available SMTAs. But the main problem is that when you've got the World Health Organization negotiating contracts with multinational pharmaceutical companies, the standard material transfer agreements don't end up looking all that standard at all. And they can include oddities like this definition of force majeure, which indemnifies companies from meeting their obligations for all the usual reasons like war and acts of God and what have you. But it also indemnifies them from meeting their obligations in the event of an influenza pandemic. So the contract that is supposed to commit companies to providing benefits like vaccines to the WHO in the event of an influenza pandemic can be completely undone by the very influenza pandemic that is supposed to trigger such obligations. Now, this, to my mind, is one of the more absurd problems with this system, as is the fact that the WHO Director General is named as the adjudicator to any disputes that may arise under the PIP framework, despite the WHO being a party to every single standard material transfer agreement made under that PIP framework. But there are a suite of other problems that we don't have time to go into now. Suffice it to say that some of my collaborators and I have been saying for years that this system essentially makes providing access to samples compulsory for provider countries, who are very often low and middle income countries, while not guaranteeing the benefit sharing side of the transaction. It doesn't work. And it's not a case of the devil just being in the details, although that certainly is the case, as you've just seen in the example of one of the standard material transfer agreements. It's a case of the concept itself being flawed, and it was never made to be applied to fixing two major problems in public health. Those issues being ensuring scientists have access to pathogen samples and associated genetic sequence data to conduct public health research and develop medical products, and the second issue being to ensure that low and middle income countries have fair and equitable access to essential vaccines, treatments, and diagnostics during an infectious disease emergency. Now, if you were to come up with a solution to these two problems from scratch, you sure as hell wouldn't come up with the ABS transaction. which complicates things and links the two issues together in a web of transactions and contracts and makes one issue entirely dependent on the other. The pandemic treaty was supposed to give us an opportunity to think creatively about solving the problems that were so apparent to everyone during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was our opportunity to come up with something bold and different, but we rushed things, and in the clamour for solutions, we've grabbed at the access and benefit sharing transaction again because it was there, and it hasn't changed all that much from the PIP framework. It's been called the Pandemic Access and Benefit Sharing System, or the PABS system, and it's appeared in every iteration of the draft text coming out of the intergovernmental negotiating body that's negotiating the pandemic treaty. The PIP framework has been the basis for the entire PABS system, the Pathogen Access and Benefit Sharing System. And despite knowing its flaws, we're back here again, and there has been a great deal of pressure put on this one article, Article 12 in most of the recent drafts, to deliver on fairness and equity in the pandemic treaty. And we know it's not going to work because ABS has never worked to deliver the sorts of benefits that were promised from the very early days of the Convention on Biological Diversity. Countries have had all sorts of issues implementing ABS at the domestic level and trying to get benefits to outweigh the costs of keeping the system afloat. And you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone familiar with the operations of the two major international multilateral systems, including the Plant Treaties multilateral system and the PIP framework, who could call them a success. Remember how I said that the PIP framework basically makes the access side of the transaction, where countries have to share their sovereign pathogenic resources with the World Health Organization. That part of the transaction is essentially compulsory, where the benefit sharing side of the transaction, where third parties share vaccines, diagnostics, and other benefits to the WHO to be distributed in the event of a pandemic, that part is optional. Well, we've basically seen the same pattern occurring in the pandemic treaty negotiations, with the language around access to pathogen samples and associated data getting stronger. Countries shall provide and shall upload, and the language around benefit sharing getting a lot weaker as the negotiations progress. Parties will encourage manufacturers and encourage labs to work with developing countries. So what I and my collaborators would have liked to have seen instead, although I think we're now stuck with access and benefit sharing, is to break the link between these two public health issues and deal with them independently of each other. I would have liked to have seen a greater emphasis on technology transfer and capacity building in developing regions that would allow them to monitor and analyse their own samples rather than having to send them off to rich countries. I'd like to see developing regions be able to supply their own pandemic-related products so they're not dependent on rich nations to donate their leftovers when they're good and ready. I think we've shown time and time again that we're not good global citizens when push comes to shove. And access and benefit sharing just entrenches this idea that the global north will have access to all the pathogen samples and all the data so that we can do our important science, and the global south will just have to wait patiently for donations once we've dealt with our own needs. Not only is that not fair and equitable, it's actually strategically a really bad way to deal with infectious disease threats. I kept mentioning my collaborators throughout this, and this is them. Mark Eccleston-Turner of King's College in London, Stephanie Switzer of Strathclyde University, and Dr. Abby Rose Hampton at the University of Leicester. And of course, I want to give a big thank you to the team at Griffith University's Biodiversity Hub, where we research all things access and benefit sharing, not just pathogen ABS. Thank you.